Okay, it's May 26th, 2026, and we're talking to Dad about influences in his life, either people or Mom expanded it to include events. And Dad said he only has a few.
Well, the first person I want to talk about that influenced me is Dean Belknap.
That doctor?
Yeah. And to understand his influence, it kind of had to go back a little bit to my grandma Latham. Probably it goes back further than her, but she had a genetic defect on her X chromosome. And
she could still have babies.
She could still have babies, and it didn't affect her health because she had another X, which was good.
So she had two X's, but one of them had a defect.
Yeah. But what it means when it's on the X chromosome, it's sex linked then.
Then you have a 50%
chance. Your daughters have a 50-50 chance of being carriers, and your sons have a 50-50 chance of being either okay or having the disease because you only have one X and it has the defect on it. And so then you are in a bad way. And it caused some sort of a kidney problem. My uncle Arnold passed away in his mid-20s from it.
So that was your grandma's son?
Yes.
Okay.
Because he obviously had that
of the two
the X.
She
had another son that passed away in his 20s too, but it was from a heart attack. He was, it wasn't. He probably wasn't a carrier.
So then you don't know for sure if Grandma Lindsay had it as a carrier or not, because she would have got one X from her dad.
Well, yeah, she would have got. She had a 50-50 chance of being a carrier. It turns out Dean thought that I had that
liver disease,
that kidney disease, and had diagnosed me early. So he assumed my mom was a carrier. It turned out Betty was the carrier because Bruce got it. He didn't die in his 20s because by then they would do kidney transplants, and so he lived a little bit longer, but eventually died from it. But not till he was a little bit older because I think he had two transplants. So they kept him alive longer. They didn't do the transplant in the 40s, like when Arnold was. But anyway, Dean assumed that I had that, and so I think that affected.
Based on what?
I don't know. Maybe I don't know just what the diagnosis was based on. I think they did urinalysis of everybody in the family and that, and I guess he thought there might have been some sugar.
When you were how old?
This was when I was probably 5 years old, 4 or 5. And I think that affected my relationship with my dad because I think he assumed that, that I would,
die in your 20s.
Die. He put me on some sort of a sulfa drug, which I don't know. I took when I was younger. I mean, it was. I don't know if it was supposed to be a cure, but it was whatever. And I think. So that affected my life in a significant way. He eventually, when I got back from my mission, I was ready to get married. He had me go to a nephrologist who told me, they were still assuming at that point that I probably had the disease, even though I was now in my mid-20s. I was 25 when I got married, but he told me not to have children because I'd pass it on.
What's a nephrologist?
Kidney doctor. A doctor it's an MD that specializes in kidneys. And the other way Dean affected me, it was in the 60s, during the Vietnam War. They put really severe restrictions on missionaries. We had a lot of young men in our ward. We had a big ward with about like 12 deacon or 12 young men that age, and
12-year-olds.
Well, 12 that were that age that went through the priesthood quorums together.
Yeah.
And most of them stayed pretty active, and most were planning on going on missions. But the church put a quote. Well, the government required the church to put a quota of 2 per ward.
Because they wanted to draft the other ones?
Because they didn't want people just going on missions to avoid the war. My older brother, got out before they put that quota on.
Got out on his mission.
On his mission.
Gary.
But the quota was in effect by the time I was old enough. I was a year and a half younger. And but by Dean claiming that I was had that kidney nephrology, I was exempt then from the quota. I could go on a mission, but since I was, he I guess did something with the draft board and basically said I couldn't be drafted because I was
sickly.
So that got me onto my mission, but it probably restricted where I went. I mean, I think we had a lot of people in California that were had health issues. I had a couple of companions that had health issues. Some, I mean, and of course they assumed I did, but I think it's obvious at this point in my life that I never had I was not a carrier. None of my kids seem to be carriers. I've never had any symptoms of it. Like I say, Bruce got it. He developed it right when he was supposed to. I mean, Betty was. I don't know about my cousin. Bruce had a sister, Sharon. I don't know if she's ended up being a carrier or not. I don't know that much about her kids. I kind of think she's not a carrier. That Betty just passed it to her son and not her daughter. But,
not either daughter, probably.
Well, she had one daughter.
Oh, Betty did. But probably Grandma wasn't a carrier either. Roberta.
Yeah, Roberta probably was not a carrier because
she had 3 boys.
She had 3 boys. None of them had it. She had 2 daughters, none of which have passed it on to their sons that at least they know of at this point.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Dean was an influence in that sense.
So when you said that that it made your dad maybe have a different...
I think I had a different relationship with my dad. I think he had a much closer relationship with Gary than he did with me. It seemed to me, and I think maybe it had to do with that.
That wasn't just your sibling rivalry?
I don't know. I might be reading more into it than it was really there. I don't know.
But maybe he was keeping his distance.
I don't know. I don't know.
When did they tell you, and what did you think about it at the time?
I don't know. Just I figured it out when I was early on. I mean, they told me stories about my uncle and I think I don't know. I figured it out when I was probably a teenager that the whole story. I mean, that they assumed I was.
That you had it.
Yeah. So anyway, I think Dean Belknap was definitely an influence in my life for a couple of those reasons that I mentioned.
You know, my brother-in-law, Jake, one of Mike's sister's brothers or husbands, they have Huntington disease in his family, which I think is similar. And he's always been really hardcore about not being tested for it and not wanting his kids tested. And some of it seems like along these lines of like, I'm not going to make huge, important life decisions like whether or not to have children based on these. I don't know.
I think by the time I was married, I was quite certain that I didn't have it, even though the nephrologist, Dr. Bloomer,
Still thought you did.
still told me that there was a good chance I did and that I shouldn't have kids. I ignored him, and I don't know. I guess I was taking a risk, but I think it was I'm okay with it. When
I'm trying to decide if my default skepticism towards medical profession comes from you or mom now. I don't know.
Like I mentioned, he got me out on a mission when
Out of the war.
And out of the war. It turns out they instituted about the same time while I was out a lottery system where you picked a number, and my number was high enough where I probably wasn't going to be an issue anyway. Mine was, you got, if you were, they drew each day of the year. They would, was assigned a number, and
based on your birthday.
Based on the date of your birth.
Yeah.
And mine was in the high 200s, and I think if you were in like below 100, I think you almost were certain to get called up, which is a big deal. I kids from my high school class, got drafted and got killed. Some of them didn't survive the war.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big deal. There was. I think the numbers were. I think if I remember correctly, were in the 50,000 young men got killed in Vietnam.
Just a side question: was Dr. Belknap still the one helping your family when your dad died and when Roberta was having her first mental health crises?
He wasn't, I don't think, too involved in
her care.
In her care, I think, of course, the other big influence on my dad, just to, continue the saga, kind of changing tunes a little bit, was that he died, and that affected me. It seemed like I was 18 at the time and didn't really have a good relationship with him. I just kind of going through that stupid teenage years where you kind of
push back,
get away. And so maybe it bothered me at least some that I didn't have a very good relationship with my dad, and then he passed on, and I think as you got a little older, think if mom would have passed away when you were 18 as opposed to when you were 28.
Yeah, or 33. Yeah, for sure.
I'll just mention this because it's kind of connected with Dean, but his mom and dad were Wilford and Louise Belknap. Wilford Belknap was my grandma Belknap, my Hazel's brother.
Okay.
They were brother and sister. Hazel Belknap was married to my grandpa Lindsay, and then Dean Belknap was the son of Wilford Belknap, which was her brother.
So Hazel was James Russell's wife?
Yes. Hazel Belknap and James Russell.
Okay.
Lindsay were married, and Louise and...
I knew maybe Grandma Marilyn had mentioned the Belknaps before.
Well, Louise Belknap had a secondary influence because she had a big influence in my dad's life. We'd go over there frequently when I was younger, and he'd visit her. She had a house over close to where Dean had lived.
That's his grandma?
No, this was his
cousin.
His grandmother's brother's wife,
So his aunt
his aunt, but it
was Louise Belknap.
was Louise, but Louise wasn't a blood relative, but
Right.
she was Dean's mother,
Got it.
and she was a big influence on my dad. I think when my dad had rheumatic fever when he was in high school and didn't do very well. He when they drafted him in World War II, he got to Texas and he got so sick they sent him home. So he didn't really serve. I mean, he was drafted, but he didn't really serve in World War II because he got so sick in basic training that in Texas that they sent him home. So he spent. He got into even with that background, my parents, his parents, Hazel and
The farmers.
expected him to take over the farm someday. Expected him to grow up and be a farmer, and he
was the oldest.
he thought he was the oldest son, and he I think figured out correctly that was probably not a good thing for him to plan on, and so he got into school, and I think his encouragement to come down and stay in school was a lot of the influence was from Louise Belknap. She almost became a secondary mother to him in a lot of ways.
Did she live down here?
Yeah, she lived in Bountiful.
Where he ended up settling down.
Yeah. But I think she had a big influence as an encouragement for him to stay in school and yeah. I wouldn't be surprised.
And has reverberations throughout the generations.
When I was in, I'd often go up this summer in the summertime and stay with my grandparents, usually with my mom's parents that lived in Shelley. I didn't for a while there because I had a paper out and I had to stay and do it but when I quit the paper out when I was in high school or whatever, I would stay up there and work. And I ended up working first for my Uncle Roland, just doing some irrigation for him there. By then my grandpa had retired, and he was doing potatoes there on a little 10-acre plot that was just being irrigated from siphon pipes from the ditch. And I was doing that for him, and he had two brothers that somehow he got me in contact with, Maurice and Marcel, that lived out in Firth, and they hired me to go out in what was called the Horseshoe. They had 160 acres out there that they leased from the owners of the land that they wanted me and my cousin to come out and move the pipe on. So we had sprinkler pipe out there that we'd go out every day and move for them.
When you were in high school?
Yeah. So that was my first. I'm mentioning Maurice and Marcel because they were the first ones that gave me a job out in the desert there, which I then did for most summers before my mission, and then after my mission even, I went up there and worked. So I worked up there out in the desert, doing different things. Started out just moving pipe, but eventually, other kinds of things. And ended up meeting Kathryn, and so I think Maurice and Marcel were influenced me in the sense that they were the first ones to give me a job out in the desert.
And what's the long term that you valued work, or you met Mom, or you had some independence?
I guess it was important to me to be outdoors and to do something physical, because to prove that I wasn't the sick kid that they thought I was. Maybe that had something to do with it. Anyway, the when I was back then, the math curriculum, you took algebra in your first exposure to algebra was in ninth grade, and then you took geometry in 10th grade. You took trigonometry if you stayed in the math program. You took trigonometry in 11th grade, and then you took some sort of college algebra and something. And you didn't even do calculus. They didn't offer it back then. At least in high schools in Davis County, they didn't. But I started, when I got to ninth grade and took algebra, that's when I probably first realized that math was really easy for me. And by the time I was taking trig as a junior, I even more realized it because I was so far ahead of the rest of the class in terms of what I understood and how easy it was for me. And the person I'm going to mention next in terms of influence was, I eventually went down to the Y for a while and then came back and my mission and took some classes. And anyway, it seemed like all the math classes I took, I always considered myself ahead of everybody in the class. I got to a math class, I think it was a advanced calculus or something, and that I took at the U. I got in the class, and there was a kid in there. I don't remember his name, but he was from Vietnam. And it was absolutely clear to me that I was not close to his level.
Well,
so that influenced me in the sense that I realized that, there were
some humility.
It humbled me to it made me realize that, I might have been. That might have been true in high school. It might have been true at BYU, but it was not true. If I wanted to pursue math, there were people that were,
your peers at least.
My peers and more.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I've always remembered him because I just remember realizing that, hey, this is. I'm not it in this class. The questions he asked, and just from the interaction with the professor, and that you could tell he was way up there. Anyway, he influenced me in that way to keep me humble. Who else was I going to mention? I think although I kind of was sort of in a master's, but also in a PhD program for a while. But when I had Lisa, I decided just to get out of school and get the master's degree, and then go to work. And Brent Blundell became an influence in the sense that he was willing to hire people that didn't have a programming background and let them learn. And I ended up working for Brent. He early on he recognized my computer skills such as they were. I took to programming. I actually thought a few times that I should have probably taken more computer stuff when I was when I was up there, but somehow just took pure math stuff. But anyway, I ended up working for Brent. He eventually got an early retirement after I'd worked for him for almost 18 years, I think, which was typically people worked in the IT department and in the company in general. If you were with the same boss for 5 years, that was long. mean, I worked for him for a long time, a lot more than than any other boss, and he kind of let me do things my way, and it was a good relationship. But when he finally left, because they gave him a real good early retirement, he went to work at another place out and it called me and actually wanted me to come work for him. But I told him at first I told him I couldn't because I'd worked there by then over 20 years, and I figured I had to get something. They had to give me some retirement benefit. They leave early, and they eventually did have a program where you could. They gave you your choice to move to Portland and keep your job, or take a 2-year severance. And 2-year severance was a pretty good benefit. I mean, that was 2 years of salary.
Yeah.
You didn't get it in a lump sum, but they just paid you for 2 years. Every month, as if you were still an employee. Mm-hmm. So I immediately went to work. I called Brent up and told him I was ready now to come work, and he said, "Yeah, come." So he hired me, and I had 2 salaries there for 2 years. That kind of helped out, and so I worked for him even after I left the power company until. For 5 or 6 years there at Comp Health, and then they got a new CIO in there, and he went one way, and I kind of ended up going to work for Discover at that point, which Discover ended up being a good place for me to end up because they wanted to keep me on as long as I wanted to work, and I wanted to keep Kathryn on insurance, and so that worked out good.
I think we've talked about Brent recently because of Mike's experiences and feeling like it's been rare and few and far between to feel like he had a good manager. And I think that I think you got really lucky.
Yeah, I think so. And I was actually even lucky at the power company too. I ended up working for a guy, I'm trying to think of his name right now. I worked for him for a year or two. And then they kind of reorganized everything, and I ended up working for a woman for the first time. And we didn't hit it off really that well.
Surprise.
My way of doing things really didn't jive with exactly how she thought I should. But eventually we did come to a pretty good understanding of how I worked now. And I got along very well with Yvette Northway. She was my boss for the last
You met
10
at Discover?
years at Discover.
Oh, okay.
But the last 10 years I was there, I worked for Yvette, and she was a good boss.
And it's not just like valuing strengths. I think it's also that people learned how to work around challenging personality things as well. Like I hope you appreciate how rare and lucky that was.
Yeah. Seems like I had a couple others in mind, but I'm trying to think now who they were. When I got back into school after we were married, I ended up working on that beaver ranch for a guy named Mac Roundy. And he and I got along pretty good. We went on a lot of trips together, moving beaver.
That's where you were when I got born, man.
Yeah, I was on a beaver trip when you were. I think on one of those trips he saved my life.
Did you fall in a river?
Nope. One of the things we do in the wintertime, you'd always move them in the wintertime because it was cold, and that's when then it was. They get too hot if you try to move them in the summer, in the truck. But they had this van, the beaver van, that was kind of a big truck. But we'd go up over the mountain from Salmon down to Hamilton. It's a mountain to go over. And you go up the mountain and then you come down. And I remember one time I'd gotten up to the top, and it was in the wintertime, and the roads were really slick. And as I got across the top, they were really slick, and I needed to get into a lower gear. But if I'd have touched the brake, I'd have went into a skid, probably skid out off the road. And he was able to reach down and get me into the lower gear by manually, reaching over
And shifting.
and well, not just you had to do something on the gas to get it to shift, and anyway, he was able to do that, and I got into that lower gear.
When you were in the driver's seat and he was
I was driving, but he was a passenger.
Oh my gosh!
But if I'd have touched that brake, we'd have not stayed on the road. But I should have, as soon as I got to the top, shifted into the lower gear. But I didn't. I started down, and I've thought a number of times that had he not been able to get me into that lower gear as quickly as he did, it would not have been it might not have ended well. So I don't know. Don't know if that was actually life threatening, but it might have been a pretty bad accident. A mountain road in the middle of
winter.
Middle of winter.
Big truck.
We there were ranches all over the West that we'd go to. Of course, that's when I was light enough when I was working for him that I did a lot of tree trimming, a lot of climbing trees and cutting them down and picking up branches. And
that's why you're good at directing Stephen.
I'd load that. He had a flatbed truck that I'd load it up with so many branches. Sometimes you couldn't see the truck. I remember I'd tie it down. But I remember they pulled me over one time on I-15 because it looked like just a bunch of trees. I mean, you couldn't see the truck. It was all, and he checked and looked at it and realized that it was tied down. It wasn't really losing anything. Sent me on my way, but yeah. But yeah, Matt was a good boss too. He offered me to kind of try to induce me to stay in the beaver business when I got after I got my master's, and I told him I was gonna go to work for the power company, and the whole business went under a few years later, not because of me, but
it's
just
more
because,
like the landman type world.
Yeah, it all went. It was that beaver pelt business stayed in business as long as it did because they'd use they'd sell the beaver to quote these rich people in California mostly that would use them as agricultural tax write-offs. But eventually, I don't know,
They just slaughter them?
Well, when they did, they slaughter them for the pelts. Yeah, they. The other thing is that beaver pelts never really became. They were hoping maybe they would become like mink and have their own kind of thing, but they were a little more popular in Russia, beaver hats, than they ever. I mean, beaver hats and coats, and
it wasn't like a fur coat or a fox or a minx.
Yeah. So, anyway, it soon after I left the beaver business, it went under, and Mac ended up driving a bus for UTA as sort of until he retired, because he didn't really he'd been in the beaver business for all of his adult life. Anyway, who else was I thinking about? Okay, that's enough.
Yeah, that's enough. We can stop.